Greeting bots and fembots. Today I wanted to bring you a review of the legendary Rainmakers.
Well, I wonder what it's like to be the Rainmaker.
Now, if you're not familiar with this particular team of Transformers, the Rainmakers were one of the millions of reuses of the Seeker animation model. Back in the original TV series in the 80s, there weren't actually that many Decepticons comparative to the number of Autobots that there were, because the characters were based off the toys that the Hasbro and Takara had to sell, and they had a lot more Autobot characters at the time. So in order to, in the show, to keep the numbers more or less equal, so the Decepticons did appear to be a genuine threat, they simply reused a lot of the existing character models. Their favorite to reuse is what eventually became known as the Seeker model. This term, it's a little bit hazy exactly where it originates from, but it's largely thought to have come from certain advertisements from department stores and the like, referring to the jet form of Decepticon as either a seeker or Decepticon seeking out the foe or whatever. Kind of like a hunter, perhaps, terminology. Regardless, the show liked to repaint this animation model because it's cheaper to reuse an existing animation model than it is to come up with a completely new design. So they would just reuse an existing one, but they would recolor it to signify it's a different character. Now, they already had 3 of these characters: Starscream, the silver, blue, and red one; Thundercracker, the blue one primarily; and then Skywarp, the black with purple trim one. But throughout the show, if you were to sit down and watch the original, especially the first 2 seasons, you can detect a bunch of these guys just basically dressed up in random colors that only appear for one episode, and aren't usually ever named either. These particular 3 here have gained some notoriety. During one of the episodes, several of the Autobots and one of the human allies actually go back to Cybertron, where they encounter a trio of Seeker-type Decepticons in pre-Earth forms, meaning they do not turn into fighter jets, but more like a starfighter, highly advanced futuristic vehicle. Again, this was the early 80s, so the vehicles they turn into still have a sort of human look, if you will. They look like vehicles that would be piloted by somebody, because after all, the Transformers turn into vehicles, so sometimes it's a little hard to think outside the box. One thing that Beast Machines did well was that its Vehicons do not look like Earth-type vehicles. They look like alien robot vehicles. That hadn't quite been mastered just yet. But regardless, the trio Decepticons attempt to drive off the Autobots by creating a large acid storm, by seeding the atmosphere.
Megatron speaks. Security on Cybertron has been breached. Destroy all intruders with rain. Acid rain.
So they were nicknamed the Rainmakers.
Well, I wonder what it's like to be the Rainmaker.
Largely by the fan base, off of one of the lines one of the Autobots says when he referred to them as rainmaking. And later on, Hasbro would pick up this title and use it as well, although I don't know if it's actually appeared directly in any fiction. But over the years, they've actually given names to these 3 essentially nobody Decepticons, thus allowing them, of course, to repaint the whatever current Seeker mold there is into more colors and sell it. This particular set here is the original Rainmakers. Original as in the characters, not the original model, the Diaclone, I believe. That's available, I believe, exclusively at Target. Unfortunately, not that it's a big deal, I don't think the word Rainmaker appears in the package anywhere. I was looking for it earlier. It did appear, I believe, when I scanned it at the checkout, but it doesn't actually say Rainmaker on the box anywhere, which is just a little disappointing, but I mean, not a big deal. It does, however, have their names individually listed on it, and they are identical. Now, one thing to keep in mind if you're considering buying this, which cost me about $80, by the way, is that they are almost monocolored, and this is actually accurate to their original model in the show, which is why. But as you can see, it's almost completely yellow, almost completely blue, almost completely green. There's splashes of color, plus the battle damage actually adds a little color to it. If you're not a fan of that, this may be the one area that you will be, because it does prevent them from looking quite so plain. So keep that in mind. If you don't like figures to be nearly one color, you might want to give them a pass. But if you don't mind and you appreciate that the attention to detail that they did make these guys as accurate to their show appearance as kind of possible, they're for diehard purists, they're spot on in that regard. All right, so I'm going to open these up for you guys, and then we can take a look at each of them individually.
We now return to the Transformers.
Now, one thing to note about this set, because they are, in fact, 3 identical models, save for the color, there's actually only one set of instructions, because after all, they all transform the exact same way. I don't believe these are even retooled, although certainly we'll find out here. But my understanding is they're just recolored versions of themselves. So keep in mind, if you already have Siege's version of Starscream, or eventually as they come out, Thundercracker and Skywarp, these guys are identical to those ones. So don't be surprised if you do decide to purchase this, you open up the box and there's only one set of instructions. Technically there's only one toy in there, just in 3 different colors. Alright, so we're going to start with Acid Storm. Perhaps at least unofficially the team's leader, if you will. He's the most famous of the 3, as he was the first one to get a name, and he's essentially named after what the Rainmakers did, create an Acid Storm. Because he was named first, he also got earlier toy releases than the previous than the other Rainmakers. So there are other green Seekers out there of the various molds. The first one, I believe, being the Classics Starscream, as in the toy line called Transformers Classics, not the classic 80s model. Although the Acid Storm was not part of the Transformers Classics line, was actually part of the Transformers Universe line, unofficially referred to as Universe 2.0, as they revamped the Transformers Universe line. It's essentially 2 different versions of it, but it only has the one name. This is Acid Storm. As you can see, he is mostly one color, which may make him a little hard to pick out some of the details. Hopefully you can still see him. But he does have splashes of color in there. He's got the light gray in the waist. He's got the dark gray for the engine components. Of course, the orange chest plate, let's call it. Most obviously, of course, is the standard Seeker head in its classic colorization. Black helmet, silver face, and red eyes. Hopefully get a good look at it. Again, this is accurate to the show. Personally, I wouldn't necessarily mind if they actually gave Seekers a little bit more individual heads, or at least like faces, expressions. But it is accurate. So if you're a diehard purist, they all had identical faces that were all colored the same. And he does have a little bit more splashes of color. He's got gray, or basically for his wrist, not really his arm, but in between his hand and arm, you can make out that there's a little bit of gray there. That's not just battle damage coloring, but it's the actual gray piece. He's got gray on his hips, and then on his feet, the gray heels and the black engines, with again a little bit of gray for the ankle, I guess. Not a huge fan of these feet, actually. They look good from the front, but from the side, not my particular taste, as they cease looking like feet at that point. But I mean, that's up to you. The wings are mostly a solid green, but there's a little bit of random gray trim here and the Decepticon logo. And if you turn them around, you can see a good deal more of the Starfighter appearance that he turns into. This is one thing, again, it's one of those mixed bags. It's accurate to the show, but not something I hugely care for. See, here's the actual cockpit of the Starfighter, which doesn't actually look like an Earth jet fighter. Whereas on his chest, he has a very Earth jet fighter looking cockpit. It's a little discombobulating, if you will, to have him look like this for his cockpit in robot mode, but then have his cockpit in fighter mode look so different. But it is accurate to the show. While they did come up with an alternate pre-Earth fighter design, they didn't really come up with an alternate pre-Earth robot design so much. Personally, I would have preferred a Siege to try to incorporate a little bit, at least, of the Starfighter look here. But, again, that's my taste. If you're a diehard purist again, I mean, this should be fantastic to you then, because they do look like Earth jets would be their alternate mode when they're in robot mode. He does come with a pair of weapons, which I'll take off so that you can hopefully see them better. They are, again, just painted the monocolor green, which, considering how he's so green, I would have appreciated a little weapon colorization to make them stand out against the model. But it's, again, probably accurate to the show, though. These do look a lot less like weapons on a fighter or even a starfighter, or a jet fighter otherwise, and more like actual handguns. So you may possibly prefer with these models to make them hold the guns, as that may look more natural than what basically looks like a rifle with a sniper scope attached to the shoulder, or if you prefer the elbow. But it's your figure. Display it how you like. Play with it how you like. Whatever your age may be. Alright, for articulation, the head is on a ball joint, allowing it to swivel back and forth, as well as a little bit up. There is light piping on the back, although somewhat obstructed by a large screw, which does mean it'll give him the dead-eye look unless he's directly behind a light source, which is why most Transformer collectors and such don't like light piping, but there are those that do, so your mileage may vary on that. Shoulders are also on a rotation and can come out a little bit thanks to the shoulder joint. Bicep swivel and an elbow bend here, actually a double jointed elbow. And the wrist is also on a swivel. And of course that applies to both arms. There is actually a waist on the figure. It's a bit hampered by the backpack, but you could still turn it without to give him at least a little side turn. The cockpit glass, if you will, of course, box cockpit, is actually cut here to allow this turn, which may not make it look particularly good. That's up to you. If you mind that the cockpit glass shifting like that, it's up to you. There's not really any kind of ab crunch, but he does have a hip swivel, and it comes out as well. It's a little bit hard to actually get past that plastic, but he can do a complete split if you want to make him jumping over somebody. There is a thigh rotation, but because the leg is so long, it actually bumps into the pelvis part here, which does limit it a little bit. But you can play with that. He does bend at the knee, and as he barely has a foot, he actually only has a little of the ankle rotation. Just enough to help him stand up if you spread the legs more naturally, but not much more. There's not really anything for a toe bend. And that really covers Acid Storm. For me, this is my second model of him. The original model I mentioned before, Classics, actually painted him in a camo army green, which gave him a larger splash of color. So this guy, being one mono-colored, essentially neon green, I guess I'd call it, is quite different than the original mold. He's also a little bit bigger. Here is the quote-unquote original Acid Storm. Again, original is a bit difficult to exactly pin down. This is the original toy of Acid Storm. But, again, the original look for Acid Storm back in the 80s was identical to Starscream, but essentially one neon green color. So you can see Classics instead give an updated kind of army camo with a lot more black, which, while I do appreciate it when Hasbro sticks to the original aesthetic for its characters as much as possible, I have to admit I actually kind of prefer the Classics look for him. It's a lot more military and a lot more visually interesting and pleasing. But again, that's my opinion. I don't hate this Siege color scheme. But I do think I do prefer the Classics slightly more. You can also see a good size difference between the two. That's because the Classics Acid Storm is a Dual X, whereas the Siege Acid Storm is in fact a Mega. Now normally when doing these toy reviews I start with them in their alternate mode, but because Siege packages them in their robot modes, I start with the robot mode. So let's get him transformed into his alternate mode and take a look at him then.
We now return to the Transformers.
Alright, and here as you can see is sort of the Starfighter, Pyramid Tri-Fighter, sort of futuristic fighter craft that the Seeker types are supposed to turn into before they, come to Earth. Again, it's still mostly a mono green color, neon green, but again, there's plenty of gray trim all over the model. The orange cockpit, Decepticon symbol, and of course there's the battle damage, or just ash, if you want to look at it that way, covering the figure. I know a lot of people aren't necessarily fans of that, but in this case it may actually be a bit of a godsend, because he would just be a real stark neon green otherwise. Like all aircraft type jet Starfire Transformers, most of the robot mode ends up underneath. That's just typical for whenever Hasbro or Takara makes these sort of designs. You can see his Storm range null ray guns mounted underneath, as the instructions refer to them. And here in the back you can see the consequences of having the fake Earthjet type cockpit, as it doesn't really have anywhere to go, so it just sticks here on the back. I mean, conceivably these two things here, the sides, could be added engines, but the orange cockpit stands out a little bit. And then you have the 3 engine in the back for the vehicle proper itself. So again, you don't often show Transformers from the back anyway, but be aware that on any model, again, whether it's the Rainmakers or Starscream and the regular classic Seekers, that's going to be a thing. Otherwise, this design actually seems fairly accurate to the original animation model, which I believe is the only place it's really existed as far as at least official Transformers go. I don't think they've ever made the pre-Earth forms of the Seekers before. I could be wrong. But other than having a little bit of the robot knees and peek at the arms, it's still actually a pretty good representation. Whether you like futuristic, not real vehicle, but science fiction type alt modes is up to you, of course. But if you are a fan of this look or interested in owning a sort of pre-Earth version of the Seekers, this does a much better job actually than most Siege does. A lot of the Siege alt modes are really just the Earth modes with a slightly futuristic, overlay to them, really. Not really significantly redesigned as they have been in the past, such as the War for Cybertron, Fall of Cybertron video games. So it is interesting for them to actually stick to the original look for the Seekers in their alt mode, when they kind of abandoned that for most of the other Siege Transformers, including the rather terrible Megatron that they made, who really just looks like an ordinary Earth tank. But as with all vehicle Transformers, it's not really any articulation in their vehicle modes. Since this is a flying vehicle, it doesn't even have wheels. It doesn't even come with landing gear, as a lot of jets do. So I guess you could count the ability to adjust the Storm range null ray cannons as articulation if you like. But there's not really the nose cone. The cockpit's got nothing. The engine thrusters aren't adjustable. There are the engines down here, which technically still have that ankle turn, if you want to count that as something, although they turn inward. But I wouldn't really consider any real articulation with this alt mode, which again, it's not really meant to have any anyway. It is, of course, a fixed wing vehicle, so no opening the S-foils to attack position.
All wings report in.
Red 10 standing by.
Red 7 standing by.
Red 3 standing by.
Red 6 standing by.
Red 9 standing by.
Red 2 standing by.
Red 11 standing by.
Red 5 standing by.
Lock S-foils in attack position.
Or anything like that. So that is one thing that Beast Transformers do tend to have over Transformers with a vehicle alt mode, is that their Beast modes often have at least some articulation. How much, of course, varies. But yeah, this is the newest, oldest version of Acid Storm. I frankly quite like the Rainmakers as a concept. I like obscure characters, whether Transformer or otherwise, that kind of have a at least slightly cool origin and dramatic sounding name. Let's bring out the original toy Acid Storm. Again, original toy is a bit confusing in this context, since technically the original toy should be the original Diaclone model in Acid Storm colors, but other than the original 3 and the Coneheads, they of course never released the Rainmakers. So in this context, original toy does not quite mean original look. However, the whole point of the Transformers Classics line was to recreate the classic Transformers, but how they might have been made with what was then modern-day current toy technology. Some molds are better than others. Their Seeker molds were actually quite good, possibly the best that's come out even today still. But you can really see the camouflaged look they went with Acid Storm back in the day, which, like I said, I actually kind of prefer a little bit. But if you are a die-hard purist, this is actually, with battle damage, the original color scheme for Acid Storm, or the unnamed green Rainmaker. I suppose if you're a true purist, maybe you wouldn't even accept the fact he has a name since it wasn't in the original show. I don't know. Alright, that really wraps up Acid Storm, however. So let's move on to his two buddies that were not given names until actually much later. Now, quick aside regarding the name. Acid Storm is named after what the Rainmakers supposedly created, an acid storm. It should be noted that acid storms are actually a real phenomenon. They can be caused here on Earth through overpollution of an area, but they also are natural events that can happen on other planets, such as Venus. The second planet from our sun actually has naturally occurring acid storms on its surface. Now, it should be noted in the original series that, as I said before, there were several Autobots and one of their human allies. But it's interesting to note, in the episode, only the Autobots are affected by the acid storm. Their human ally, Chip, if I recall correctly, is not harmed by it. This could be an error on the developer's part, but it could also theoretically be looked at as perhaps an improper or imprecise translation from Cybertronian to, English. Possibly whatever it was the Rainmakers created wasn't actually an acid storm, but was something that reacted like acid, but only to Cybertronians. Whereas humans and human technology, such as his clothing and I believe his wheelchair, weren't affected. Make of that what you will. But it's interesting to note, as he was initially the only character that got a name, he got named after what the Rainmakers did. But following suit, the other Rainmakers were all given Storm-type names. So they kind of have a sort of matching set, unlike Starscream, Thundercracker, and Skywarp, or Thrust, Ramjet, and Dirge, whose names don't really have anything in common with each other.